Today on Pilot's Discretion, our guest is flight simulator expert and airline pilot Evan Reiter. He tells us what's new in flight sim, how to use virtual air traffic control, and what his Canadian music connection is. Pilot's Discretion starts right now. Hi pilots, I'm John Zimmerman, and thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion from Sporty's. Visit sportys.com/podcast for today's show links and access to our complete archives. And remember to leave us a review in your favorite podcast app so other pilots can find the show. Today I'm joined by Evan Reiter, who is, like many guests on Pilot's Discretion, in that he's a self-described, quote, aviation nerd through and through. That's true of a lot of us. Evan is an airline pilot, so he has daily experience with commercial aviation, but he's also the co-founder of the Flight Simulation Association, an industry group that puts on the annual Flight Sim Expo. And more than that, he's just an all-around flight sim expert, so we'll definitely be talking about that. When he's not flying regional jets or his own simulator, he's a virtual air traffic controller for VATSIM, the online ATC service. Evan, welcome to Pilot's Discretion.
Thank you so much, John. Thanks for having me.
The Flight Sim Association released an interesting study earlier this year, which we'll link to in the show notes. And this report tried to measure the impact of home flight sims on aviation training, not just as a game, but using it to really learn something. And I know when some listeners hear the phrase home flight simulator, they may be picturing a big certified device, maybe a basic ATD or advanced ATD. But something you point out regularly is that you really don't need that $5,000, $10,000 setup to get real training value. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was actually a big part of what we were doing is most of the, what I would call flight simmers. So maybe people who don't have any flying experience, don't ever want to fly an airplane. They aren't using the BATD. They aren't necessarily using the $10,000 setup. They might be using an Xbox or a tablet, or most commonly probably now a desktop computer, one or two monitors, and maybe they've got a joystick or a yoke and some rudder pedals. Like that's the typical setup that a lot of people will not just start with, but use for many years with various little bits added on here and there. And so I think when people are thinking about home flight simulators, especially if they're pilots, sometimes they're looking at the very high end of the spectrum, when in fact, I would be advocating to start simple, even with some of the equipment that you might already have. And a lot of the benefit is actually coming from that simple setup that can be used to replicate a whole bunch of different airplanes and get online and fly with Pilot Edge or VATSIM versus something that's more of a purpose-built simulator that you might see, say, at a flight school or an airline training department that really only does one particular airplane.
There's this theory out there that lots of time flying a home simulator can create bad habits. Maybe it makes you lazy on the rudder pedals or you're too focused on the panel instead of looking out the window. Is there any validity to that, or is that just kind of an old wives' tale?
I don't think there is. And we have in that report that you just mentioned, there was actually another study that was done, I think it's out of either Australia or New Zealand, where they looked at this question and they tried to work with flight instructors and students who were using home flight simulators and really figure out like what was that all about. And they couldn't find anything. Like they had this theory that the flight instructors had this theory that there was actually a problem. But then when they looked into the data and the students' scores and how they were being evaluated, there was really no difference between people who were using flight simulators and people who weren't in terms of those items that you just mentioned. So I think it's a little bit of a, just like you say, kind of old wives' tale, to be honest. There's very good things that simulators can do for us in terms of procedures and flying instrument approaches and talking with air traffic control. And then there's things that really flight simulators probably shouldn't be used for. And that's hands and feet flying or, trying to look outside. Like, I mean, if you're especially go back 5 or 10 years and even further than that, the visuals in a flight simulator were not worth looking at, to be quite honest. And certainly even the real simulators, the full motion level D sims that we use that are certified to help airline pilots train to land an airliner, they don't fly like the real thing. In fact, I have a separate technique that I use to land the simulator from the technique that I used to land the airplane, because if I use the exact same technique, it just won't work. It'll float halfway down the runway. So that's my perspective, but that also is shared by members of our training department and by other pilots that I've flown with. I think you have to use the simulator for the purpose that it is designed and not try to use it to become a great hands and feet pilot. That's not what it's for. Go actually get in the airplane for that stuff.
And if I have a home flight sim and I've mostly used it for fun, and I want to go to the next level and actually use it for training, what's the simplest thing I can do to get maybe some more training value out of I've got a yoke and throttle sitting on my desk and I've got X-plane. fired up, and all I ever do is fly around or, do the classic loops and rolls. What should I do to transition more to a training mindset?
Go buy a cheap headset from your local electronics store, plug it into your computer, and then join VATSIM or Pilot Edge. So those are the two big online air traffic control services that are compatible with X-Plane, Prepared, FSX, Microsoft Flight Simulator, and a couple more, I think Flight Gear even now. So that service basically lets you see other airplanes, lets you speak with air traffic controllers if you want, and in a couple of different ways. There's two very different models. Allows you to just add that extra element to your flight. So just like in real life, if you want to go and do a VFR flight out of an untowered airport, you don't need to speak with air traffic control. You don't need to file a flight plan. But just by virtue of the fact that you're connected and that other people can see you and that you may actually see another airplane taking off and landing while you're in that airport, that will force you to start treating this a little bit more realistically. So perhaps you're going to pull the checklist out, which you probably haven't been doing so far. And you might actually stop holding short of the hold short line and make your radio call like you would in real life. And of course, you can add to that by speaking with air traffic control and flying into towered fields and actually flight planning. So I find that is just the simplest and easiest. There's definitely a learning curve, but in terms of almost forcing yourself into taking the simulator environment slightly more seriously, when someone is watching, you've got that extra set of eyes and that extra reason to pay attention to this. I could probably spend the entire podcast talking about other ways to use the simulator for training, but that'd be my number one.
That's a great tip, and it's overlooked. I find a lot of pilots don't really understand there's this whole world of online ATC out there that can take the flight sim experience from a very solitary thing into much more interactive and community-based. Your survey has an interesting point in there that you show that pilots who used a home simulator with online air traffic control saved about 5.5 hours during flight training compared to those who didn't, which is pretty compelling. That's, as you say, probably $1,000 at least in today's flight training world. Why do you think that is? Is it just familiarity with ATC when you get on the radios, or is there more going on there?
I think it's this huge leg up, and we talk about chair flying, and then Sporty's actually talks about the whole Infinite Flight partnership being the chair flying 2.0. That's what home flight simulation is. If you've been using this effectively throughout your pilot training, and we looked at private pilots, but think instrument rating, think other forms of training, of course, as well. If you're using this effectively throughout your training, you've done everything that you're going to do before you've gotten in the airplane. So yes, you don't know how the exact right amount of rudder pedal pressure is to apply when you're on the takeoff roll. Nobody's expecting that. But the fact that you know that you have to have your feet on the rudder pedals, like that's already a leg up. And yeah, sure, you know air traffic control, you know airspace, you know regulations, because you've been forced into learning this stuff through VATSIM or Pilot Edge when you thought it was just a game and when you were only learning it so that you wouldn't get yelled at by somebody else. Now you're walking into your flight school having all of that knowledge, and it's just a matter of bringing it into the equation. So I'm not thinking about, oh gosh, what am I going to say when I press this push to talk button? That part's already done, and I can just focus on, okay, now I'm taxiing up to the runway, so I need to be able to stop myself while I'm pressing this push to talk button. I think that's really the main thing that is allowing flight simulation to have this impact on pilot training.
I know you're a controller for Boston Center on VATSIM, so tell us what your side of the quote-unquote scope looks like when you're doing that. If I fire up my sim and I blast off, what are you doing in your side of things?
Yeah, what I like about virtual air traffic control is that it's, especially on the radar side, pretty much close to identical to what real FAA controllers see. Obviously, if you're working in a tower environment, I'm not physically sitting in an airport tower looking with my binoculars out the window at you taking off and landing. So there's some differences there, although some people have some pretty cool wraparound setups where they've done a little bit of that. But in terms of approach and center, it looks and works very similarly to how the actual FAA systems look. And so as an airline pilot, and as you said, an aviation nerd through and through, it's a lot of fun to be able to see the other side of things and understand how different airspaces interact and how different routes are structured the way they are, and to know that I can ask for this shortcut here because that works, but I shouldn't ask for it here because they won't be able to give me that most of the time. That's a really fun just piece of knowledge that I've been able to bring into real world flying. But as somebody who's maybe a general aviation pilot or just, interested in aviation, the training on VATSIM to become a controller is free. It's a lot of work. It's self-paced. You've got to do a lot of reading, including basically reading the controller's equivalent of the AIM, which is the 7110.65 predominantly. So there's a lot of work involved to it, but it's a really interesting new dynamic to bring to the flight simulation world. And if I'm looking at a radar screen, I can really be doing that just as easily from my home computer as I could if I was sitting in Boston, Tragon, and Nashua.
Now, it seems like there's almost a little bit of a stigma associated with the online ATC thing. There are some controllers I know do it, but don't really want to talk about. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, and actually, so our survey, which was a two-part survey, looked at both the pilot side and the air traffic control side. So you mentioned already that 5.5 hour savings. I should mention as well that the average in the survey of how long it took people to get their private was 55 hours, which is about 20 hours less than the national average. So that's a huge savings, like just looking at everybody in the survey, not just doing that comparison directly about home flights and online aviation. So big savings on the pilot side. But we also wanted to try to figure out what is the impact to air traffic controllers. I mean, people see airplanes, they kind of get that like pilot is a career or that they can do it recreationally. But I don't know that people really think about air traffic control in the same way. And so we were wondering, were people who would control on VATSIM or Pilot Edge as they were kids growing up, might they maybe think of this as a career? And the statistics showed that out of the 14 air traffic controllers that we found who were VATSIM or are current VATSIM controllers and who now work for the FAA, almost all of them, 13 out of the 14, said, yes, this was a big factor in why I decided to apply in the first place. 100% of them checked out successfully at their first facility, and 8 out of 10 of them who had a class ranking actually finished at the top of their class, which is super important for controllers because that gives you your first pick of facility where you will basically start off your career. But I think maybe there's a little bit of, and at least this is what the rumor is from what I've heard from other controllers, you have those couple people who just spoil it for everybody. So some people who approach the FAA or who approach the academy going, well, I'm a controller on VATSIM, so I know this, just like as ridiculous as that sounds as somebody walking into an airliner going, I've flown the 737 at Microsoft Flight Sim, so I should be able to land this plane, right? Like that's not what we're going for here, people. So I think there might have been a little bit of that has perhaps drawn into it. And, same thing as some pilots, maybe especially some of the people who have only had experience with some of the older generation flight simulators or who have only used maybe a BATD that they didn't really get along with. And I've got plenty of those stories myself. They may just go, well, this stuff isn't real, so what's the value? But obviously they're missing the point.
Yeah, it's a good point on the latest generation of flight sims. If somebody's last experience was, Flight Sim 2004, it's an entirely different experience now. It's really not the same product at all. You mentioned the inspirational value there, and we've been talking a lot about the practical uses for flight sims, which I believe in as well, but we can't overlook that inspirational. You talk about controllers who were inspired by it. What do you think we as an industry should do to take advantage of the excitement that's created by these sims among, especially young aviation enthusiasts? I'm 13. I think I like airplanes. I'm using flight sims. Is that a legitimate pathway into the industry?
Yeah, I love one of the nice things about VATSIM is that I've seen people like sort of grow up. So I'll know them or meet them when they're 13, that profiler person that you mentioned, and now they're an airline pilot, or now they're flying, at the military level, or now they're an air traffic controller. And it's just such a cool thing to have watched them go through this transition and to have seen, which is exactly the case for me, that flight sim was 100% the reason that they got into that. So I think both from the pilot and the controller side, we should be thinking about this as almost like an early recruiting tool. Why don't airlines have their pilots flying flight simulators on Twitch or on YouTube as a thing to help advocate for this industry and as a thing to help people be thinking about getting into careers? Why don't we have the FAA looking at people in VATSIM who are already doing this or Pilot Edge, not to say, okay, you should be selected for the academy because you happen to have a rating on VATSIM, but to be saying, well, gee, there's this huge group of people out there who are basically doing the job for free in their spare time. Maybe some of them might be interested in filling this massive staffing shortage that we have right now. So I think there's a lot of ways that we could tap into this. You have to do it in a genuine way. So it can't just be a marketing ploy. It should be people who have legitimate experience in it, like myself, perhaps, who are airline pilots who also play in both spaces. But I think there'd be a really interesting opportunity for airlines to consider as part of the outreach and the youth outreach they're already doing, this world of flight simulation that's out there.
Let's talk briefly about what's new in flight sim, kind of state of the market, because I think some people may feel like this was a COVID boom and bust, and the Microsoft Flight Sim 2020 came out during the pandemic, but then things kind of got quiet. But this year at Flight Sim Expo, I know it was packed with news, lots of excitement there. There's some new honeycomb rudder pedals that have come out recently. You mentioned Sporty's partnership with Infinite Flight, and the big news, there's a new Microsoft Flight Simulator coming out next month, which a lot of people expect to be a big deal. So what's the current state of the market right now in flight sim?
I think that's what everyone's looking at is the new Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024 release that's coming up in November next month, as you say. There is a lot of excitement in both the traditional flight sim community and I think even more broadly. I think we're all hoping that they do a good job of sort of keeping the core flight simmer person who really just wants the ability to fly their desired airliner from point A to point B in the way that they structure. We're all hoping that that sort of stays unchanged, and I think it will. But they've added onto that this cool other dimension of flying. So instead of just looking at airliners or just looking at kind of, okay, go fly your airplane and do whatever, now we've got what seems to be career and mission oriented things like flying helicopters and hot air balloons and skywriting and sky banners and just like other forms of flying that could also be careers that could follow what might be a typical pilot's journey, such as my own, where started off flight training, went and flew Navajo's, King Airs, smaller airplanes and cargo operations and some scheduled passenger stuff, and then moved up to the airline. So that aspect, that whole career piece has been really not available before. And I think if they do it right, being able to tie in a pilot's career with different forms of flight simulation in the actual simulation environment will be really interesting. And then, of course, add to that really cool looking extra visuals, new features and functionality. The community is super excited about that. And then also, in addition to the honeycomb pedals and some of the things that you've just mentioned, we're seeing more and more interest in what I would maybe say are kind of like niche flight sim hardware creators, people who have historically focused maybe on a small subset of the flight sim world, like the military piece of it, now moving into civilian flight simulation. So we had a lot of that at our show, WinWing coming up with some brand new hardware that was quite a surprise to a number of people that was in the civil space for the first time just about 3 weeks ago. Now, at the time this comes out, Virpil announced a brand new flight controller that's civilian focused for the first time. So we're seeing like high-end flight controls that would have historically targeted a very small subset of the flight sim world becoming more mainstream, becoming less expensive. And so that means for the home flight simmer, instead of having maybe like one or two choices in the kind of entry-level price range, we have a lot more functionality, a lot more hardware that's much more accessible. So I think it's getting easier than ever to get into, and the software that powers all of this is getting more powerful. So I think, in summary, it's a great time to become a flight simmer.
I'm biased, but I would agree with that. And certainly for a lot of people, they may think, okay, Microsoft Flight Sim 2024, and I'll get a honeycomb yoke. And that's a great place to start. I wouldn't talk you out of it, but there are some interesting new products, as you mentioned. I think the infinite flight piece is even interesting. It's probably not an everyday power user sim, but for something that can be done on your tablet, just the convenience factor is exciting. That really is something we didn't have certainly 10 years ago. So it's a good time to get into it. If I've got Microsoft 2020 and I see 2024 comes out, it's first worth pointing out it's not an automatic upgrade thing. It's a new product. How should I evaluate that? If I'm a pilot who uses it, how do I look at whether I need to buy the new one or not?
The nice thing about the flight simulation community is there are a ton of people who will broadcast their flight simulation experience to the world. And so even if you're someone who's not a flight simmer now, but you're sort of thinking about it, if you just search Microsoft Flight Simulator and then add the word Twitch, TWITCH to that, or even YouTube, you will see all kinds of people, varieties of people, from those who are brand new and frankly don't really know what they're doing, to airline pilots who are doing things super realistically, to people who wish they were airline pilots who maybe aren't doing things quite as well. You'll find all of that, but you can watch as these people, we call them content creators, will go and fly various forms of flight simulation. And you can find people who are using it more seriously for training. You can find people who are using it for airliner simulation or for general aviation flying. So if you're trying to see what the experience is like, going to find some of this content on the platform Twitch, which is like YouTube, but for live streaming, is a great way to learn a little bit more about what this looks like before you actually make that decision yourself. And many of these content creators would be folks who are walking around the show floor at Flight Sim Expo as well. So on their channels, you'll probably see some of the footage from them out at the show and prove that they're actually real people.
Evan, let's take a quick break and we'll be back with some more questions.
Earn all your pilot ratings and keep your flying skills sharp with Sporty's Pilot Training Plus. This all-inclusive membership unlocks Sporty's complete library of award-winning video courses, so you can learn anywhere you have your phone, tablet, or laptop. For one annual fee, you get access to over $1,500 in courses, a smart investment in your flying career. Plus, enjoy free shipping every day of the year at Sportys.com and apply for one of our 3 annual flight training scholarships. Learn more at Sportys.com/pilot training. Now, back to Pilot's Discretion.
We are back with Evan Reiter, who is not just a virtual pilot. His day job is flying regional jets for an airline. So, Evan, thinking back on your journey from flight sim enthusiast to professional pilot, which you talked about just recently there, which skills did you have to learn from real-world experience, and which ones did flight simulators actually teach you reasonably well?
Real-world experience, there's no substitute for actually flying, hands and feet flying the aircraft, especially in different weather conditions, in mountainous regions where things are happening differently than they do in flatland flying. Those are the things that I would say happen to me more in real life, dealing with things like icing, adverse weather, deviating around thunderstorms. Those are the kinds of things that just happen in the real world that I think are very difficult to accurately model in a flight simulator. But short of that, almost everything else I would say that flight sim has played a role in, the biggest thing being comfort with speaking with air traffic control and having a really good understanding of aviation regulations across North America. Airline pilots will fly to various parts of the world. My flying tends to be mostly focused on Canada and the United States, which, despite sharing a big border and being very, very close together, have a lot of very different procedures for some reason. And so being able to work Boston Center on VATSIM and then feel comfortable flying into places in Canada was a really valuable asset that I would say I got predominantly from the flight sim world. That's the stuff that we've sort of talked about already, but it's just, focus on what the actual flight simulator can help you with. And then I think the other piece would just be getting familiar with new aircraft types. So as I've gone into flying larger aircraft, I wouldn't say that I'm always trying to practice like actual flying in, say, a CRJ or an Embraer, but being able to see the panel and actually press a button instead of look at a poster on my wall and try to understand what a button does is a huge advantage. And I think you could take that to the general aviation level and say, if you wanted to practice with a G1000 or a 430, you can do that really nicely in the simulator with just even a laptop and a mouse. You don't even need to put the airplane in the air if you don't want. I know Garmin has their own little trainer, which was quite helpful when I was learning the 650. But if you wanted to, take that into actually flying an aircraft in your simulator and be able to learn a little bit more about how that GPS stuff works, I think that's another great way that these technologies can help us.
Avionics is such a part of learning new airplanes these days. I would argue in some airplanes, it's the majority of what you learn when you check out on a new airplane. And sure, a flight simulator may not be a perfect representation of those avionics, but neither were the paper tigers you're, referring to, where we used to sit around and, push the wallpaper. It's certainly an upgrade from that. You talk about transitioning to new airplanes and training at the airline. Obviously, that involves simulators of a very different kind, the very expensive full motion certified sims. Does that share anything with home flight simulators, or are those things just so different it's an entirely different experience?
I think they're really different. And actually, I think in some cases that's to their detriment. When I go back to my flight school experience, I remember we had some BATDs fixed base there that we used in sort of a lab, and they were terrible. I mean, they didn't fly very well. It was like a lot of work to try and keep them straight and level because they were so touchy, they were glitchy, they would crash. It was a really terrible experience. I would leave that sim lab having learned nothing. Then I would go to my home flight simulator, which cost a fraction of those things, and go do whatever we were just doing so I could feel like I was doing it properly. And so actually, I feel like sometimes the real world almost gives the home flight sim world a bad name. In the airline world, the full motion sim, and don't get me wrong, people have created their own full motion sims of airplanes at home. That's something that can be done. I don't know if it's advisable for somebody who wants to keep their bank account or their marriage intact, but it is possible. Short of those two things, though, most of what we're using at work is not typically the same software or hardware that you tend to see in a lot of home flight sim. And so that means the visuals are substantially worse. And that means that other than the fact that the physical panel looks like the airplane, I don't really feel like it's quite as full of an experience. So it's there to serve a purpose, which is to have us pressing the right buttons and be able to get the motions in place and at least feel comfortable enough that when we're landing at actual airplane for the first time will mostly get it on the runway.
What was harder learning to fly at the airline? Is it the flying the airplane part, managing the systems, or is it the policies, procedures, managing people, the softer skills?
I think as a first officer, a new hire coming into the airline, especially if you haven't flown a jet before or you haven't flown something that's a relatively automated piece of equipment, then it's definitely the airplane itself and just trying to get all that stuff in your memory and understood. When you've done this for 5 or 6 years, it's very easy to sort of pick up on and remember all these little details. But when you're drinking from the fire hose at the very beginning, you're trying to figure out, is this piece of information going to be helpful for me right now? Or do I only need to know that once every 500 flights? And then maybe I'll find a way to put that in a piece of paper somewhere I can reference later on. But I think when you get some time at the airlines, and especially as you move from a first officer to a captain, then it becomes all of those other things. So policies, procedures, dealing with people, both flight attendants and dispatchers and gate agents, and the many different facets that we have to coordinate. At the time that you especially take your first command, but then even going down the line from that, I think all of that other stuff becomes almost secondary, except that, of course, the main thing is we need to fly the airplane safely and make sure that that part's getting done. But when you've done it for a while, the airplane flying part is generally easy if things are going the way they're supposed to. And it's all the other stuff that you're trying to finesse to make sure that everyone on board has a safe and a comfortable and an on-time experience.
All right, Evan, we always close Pilot's Discretion with a lightning round called Ready to Copy. I'll throw out some questions on a wide range of topics, and you read back with your quick answer. Are you ready to copy?
Ready to copy.
What was your first flight simulator?
It was Microsoft Flight Simulator 10 FSX.
What's your favorite airplane to fly in a sim?
I'll have to go back to the earlier days when I was flying in the sim a lot more often, and that was the Level D 767, which was a remarkably well-simulated aircraft that looked beautiful and that performed extremely well right down to pretty much all the systems. Of course, I've never flown a real 767, but from what I've seen and what I understand and from what I was looking for at the time, it was great.
What's your favorite flight sim hardware?
There's so many good options there. The Honeycomb Alpha, probably just because of what it did for the industry, it really opened up the potential for us as a flight sim industry to think of a purpose-built flight sim controller that was functional enough to support a wide variety of aircraft. Just the amount of buttons, switches, the way that that piece of hardware came into our industry, I think it was both good timing, but also the fact that that piece of equipment was designed the way it was. It really opened the market for the wide variety of choice that we have right now. And I think it's still a great, as you mentioned earlier, a great first piece of hardware for someone who's putting together a flight simulator.
What's the worst thing to practice in a home simulator?
Anything that involves hands and feet, really. So if you're trying to practice a crosswind landing, for example, I don't think you're going to get very far. You'll get the mechanics of it. You get the concept, that we have to be landing with probably one wing down and on one wheel before the other. Like that stuff is there. But trying to finesse that with your hands and feet, I don't think a flight simulator is the right place to be doing that.
If you can invent any flight sim product, software or hardware, money is no object. You get to absolutely ignore all the usual constraints. What would you invent?
I want the ability, and I actually think maybe this is where flight sim is going in the future. I want the ability to turn my desk into some sort of a virtual cockpit without having to wear a VR headset or some sort of a weird piece of technology. I want to be able to say, okay, I'm flying a 737 and there it is in front of me and I can see it without too much in front of my face. I can touch a button and feel that I'm touching that button. I can manipulate the FMS with that same piece of glove or whatever I'm wearing on my hand. And then a minute later, I can transform that into a Cessna 172. And I think I'd wager to say that all of that technology exists in some form already, but being able to make that at the right price points and accessibility for the consumer level, we may be some time from. But I think that may be where flight sim is going. And if I could take the experience of flying in a full motion simulator that I get right now and just instantly create that out of thin air somewhere, that's what I do.
All right, moving to VATSIM or even the real world, what's one communications mistake you wish pilots would stop making?
It's a push to talk button, not a push to think button. So have a good idea of what you plan to say before you actually say it, and give yourself a couple more seconds before you check on to a new air traffic control frequency, especially if you're about to spell out your life story.
That is great advice and well said. I'm going to steal that phrase. What's the most surprising thing about life as an airline pilot? When you were new, what was not what you expected?
The role that pilots play is almost like integrators or coordinators. At the end of the day, it's the people on the front lines, but especially the pilots who can kind of see the whole picture as it relates to one individual flight. And so I guess I thought that things might be a little bit more, everything's already done for you. And to some extent, that's true. But when things especially start to go sideways and we're dealing with weather or regular operations, the role that a crew can play in some cases in asking for, fuel truck to come by at that moment, and in some cases not asking and sort of just quietly letting things play out. I think that was something I didn't really realize, just how much work we pilots, flight attendants, and other frontline employees do on the ground behind the scenes to make that flight go on time, that hopefully if we're doing our jobs well enough and if everything aligns, you never have to find out about as a passenger flying in the back.
You shared some great trivia with me recently. You told me that during your days flying King Airs at a smaller operator, among other interesting passengers, you got to fly the band Nickelback, who has a checkered reputation on the internet. Some love, some hate. It's become a meme. So are they unfairly ridiculed, or do they deserve the hate?
Having flown them and met them, phenomenally nice people. And I would say that they don't deserve any hate whatsoever. They should be loved. And you know what? There's a few Nickelback songs in my Spotify, so I'm happy.
All right. I know you're a big skier. So what's a skill you've developed as a pilot that helps you on the slopes? Is there any connection there at all?
I like to think that I'm a little bit more intentional about navigating and trying to find the best route down a ski slope. And maybe there's a little bit of a connection there from flying. We're always trying to find the most efficient way to do things. And we're always trying to think about how can I save 5 or 10 minutes here or there to try and save some costs while keeping everything safe and keeping everybody comfortable. So I want to say I approach skiing with that as well. I'm always the first one at the bottom of the chairlift right on time. And I'm trying to think, how do I maximize this day to get as many runs in as I can, especially while the powder's still fresh?
That sounds like a lot of pilots I know.
Right?
Our last question is always the same, Evan. You have one final flight, and we want to know, what are you flying and where are you going?
I've been giving this one some thought, and I was listening to Courtney Miller a couple of episodes ago, and he's like, this is a terrible answer, but I'm going to give it anyway. And then he said what was going to be my answer. So now I feel much better about this, and I feel comfortable enough to say it. I fly the CRJ right now. I would still be flying the CRJ. I love this airplane. I would be doing a golden hour evening approach into DCA, the river visual runway 19. The autopilot's off. The flight director's off. We're flying the airplane the way that Wilbur intended when he gave Orbital his type rating way back when. And, it's I guess, just pedestrian. It's what I do all the time, but it's so much fun. And every time I do it, I kind of just go, why am I allowed to do this?
Evan, great answer. And thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much, John.
Thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion, brought to you by Sporty's, training and equipping pilots worldwide for over 60 years. For more episodes and today's show links, visit sportys.com/podcast. I'm John Zimmerman. We'll see you next time on Pilot's Discretion.